Increasingly over the last 10 or so years, team building in the NBA has shifted from finding that one star caliber player to be the face of the franchise and surrounding them with complementary talent to trying to cram as many stars onto one team at once and figuring out the other pieces later, most commonly referred to as a super team. There are a couple of different teams in NBA history that you could pinpoint as the true origin of the super team era, but that isn't really the point of today's video, because we all already know about the star combinations that actually were created. The Heatles, the Celtics Big Three, the KD era Warriors, the Derrick Rose Knicks. Okay, maybe not them. Anyway, the point of today's video is to talk about some star combinations that could have been in the NBA. Each of these that I'm going to talk about are realistic pairings that could have actually occurred either via the draft or highly reported and rumored free agency decisions and near trades. A lot of these are pretty unbelievable to think about, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. Number 1, LeBron James and Giannis Antetokounmpo. It didn't take long for me to get right into a bombshell, did it? But this is absolutely true. The relatively undisputed best player in the world for the better part of the last 10 years, and the presumptive MVP for this season, a player that has a real chance of being the face of the league for the post-LeBron era, could have very easily been teammates with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Here's how. Back in 2013, the Cavs were coming off of an awful season and held the number 1 overall pick in that year's draft, while also simultaneously, whether they knew it or not, being just a year away from LeBron James returning to Cleveland in the summer of 2014. So with the first overall pick, they selected Anthony Bennett, who played a total of 52 games and scored a little over 200 points with the Cavs before being shipped off elsewhere. And then, 14 picks later, the Milwaukee Bucks selected a skinny kid out of Greece who would go on to turn around their franchise and, as I said, will more than likely win the MVP this season at just 24 years old. And honestly, it would have been just that simple. Had the Cavs realized what was in front of them in the 2013 draft with Giannis, it would have only been a year later that the King returned to play by his side and form a terrifying NBA star duo. And honestly, the craziest part of this whole situation doesn't even stop there. Because if you swapped out Giannis for Anthony Bennett on those Cavs teams, you could keep the rest of the eventual roster intact as well. Kyrie Irving was already there after being drafted in 2011, as was Tristan Thompson, and even though Bennett was in the Kevin Love deal, he wasn't a significant part of it at all, and the Wolves would have taken that trade even without him on the table. So essentially, if the Cavs had drafted Giannis in 2013 instead of Anthony Bennett, they could have not only had one of the best players of all time and the next era's potential best player on the same team, but they would have rounded out their starting 5 with Kyrie Irving, Kevin Love, and Tristan Thompson. Now that is a super team if there ever was one. Number 2, Derrick Rose and any of the Miami Heat Big Three. Okay, this might actually be an even bigger deal than the LeBron and Giannis one, and it's one of the crazier what-if stories to be almost completely forgotten about in the modern NBA. This is a pretty big and detailed situation, so I'm going to have to cover it briefly, but I'm going to get out a video dedicated solely to this story very soon that will go much more in-depth. Anyway, take yourself back to the summer of 2010. Rumors are swirling about the possible free agency destinations of a lot of players, with multiple combinations being thrown around. Ultimately, as you know, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh decided to join the Miami Heat and ended up winning 2 championships as a result. But for a good chunk of that summer, it was heavily reported that it was actually Chicago that would end up signing at least part of the eventual Heatles Big Three. The primary target was Wade, a Chicago native, and the belief was that if they could secure his commitment, then James or Bosh would follow him to the Bulls. Wade had multiple extensive meetings with the higher-ups in the Bulls organization, and by all reports, it was a legitimately tough decision to choose Miami over Chicago. The biggest reason it didn't happen? Money. The Bulls would have been able to bring in 2 of the 3 stars that eventually signed in Miami, assuming they could find a taker for Luol Deng's contract, while the Heat had the ability to sign all 3. There are more intricacies to it than that, but essentially that's what it came down to. Wade, James, and Bosh all wanted to play together, specifically with Bosh as a frontcourt player rather than Derrick Rose. But just imagine for a second what that would have been like. Derrick Rose, who would become the youngest MVP in league history the season immediately following all this, by the way, the hometown kid Dwayne Wade, and the king, LeBron James. Add in eventual Defensive Player of the Year Joakim Noah and a shooter for extra spacing, and that team would have been insane. Number 3, Jimmy Butler and Kawhi Leonard. This is all about pairing one of the best coaches and specifically defensive minds in basketball during this era with two of the best defensive wings of this era together on the same team. And of course, I'm talking about Spurs coach Gregg Popovich and Kawhi Leonard and Jimmy Butler. Going back to the 2011 offseason, the Spurs were coming off of a 61-win season, but were in the market for some upgrades after losing in the first round of the playoffs. As we all know, they made the, at the time, tough decision to send George Hill to the Pacers for the pick that became Kawhi Leonard during the 2011 draft, who would go on to lead them to a championship before eventually winning out and being traded to the Raptors. But there is an extra wrinkle to that draft for the Spurs that could have made things that much more interesting. San Antonio actually held 2 first-round picks that year after the Hill trade, the 15th, which they used to select Leonard, and their own at number 29. With that pick, they selected guard Corey Joseph, who has become a fine NBA player, but immediately after that, with the 30th overall pick, the Bulls selected eventual All-Star Jimmy Butler. Now obviously each of these guys are now playing on different teams than the ones that drafted them, but maybe they both would have stuck around if they were playing together in San Antonio. It is crazy to think about how good the Spurs would have been defensively with both of these guys on the same team. Pop has always figured out a way to put together a top defensive team with or without elite wings like Kawhi, and the combination of those two is something that I wish we could have seen. Numbers 4, 5, and 6, Steph Curry and Paul George, or Gordon Hayward, or Kevin Love. Alright, this one gets a bit more complicated than the last entry on the list simply because there are so many possibilities here. We all know that the Golden State Warriors have become an incredible super team with the addition of Kevin Durant, and they were breaking regular season win records even before that. But among all the other brilliant moves and draft picks made by the front office to build this team, there is one big draft miss that could have changed things completely. And that explains the first 2 star combinations in this entry. Back in 2010, the Warriors held the 6th overall pick and lacked any kind of real direction. They drafted Steph Curry the year before and would go on to draft Klay Thompson in 2011 and Draymond Green in 2013 to build their championship core. But the 2010 draft could have provided even more star power. With the 6th pick that year, the Warriors decided to bolster their frontcourt, which had long been an issue and was only really solved once they traded Monte Ellis for Andrew Bogut in 2012 by drafting a shot-blocking big man out of Baylor named Epke Udoh. While just a few picks later, eventual All-Star wings Gordon Hayward and Paul George were drafted with back-to-back selections. Yes, even before KD got there, the Warriors could have had an elite wing player to add to their talented backcourt, and to be honest, it isn't really fair to nitpick a team's draft record that selected the 2 greatest shooters of all time and a Defensive Player of the Year in 3 different draft classes in a span of 5 years. But man, this really was a big miss, because Udoh never really did much for the team and is still just kind of hanging on in the league. The other part of this entry is a pretty well remembered one, the trade that nearly sent Kevin Love to the Warriors to team up with Steph Curry. Back in 2014, Golden State considered breaking up their blossoming Splash Brothers duo by trading Klay Thompson for a frontcourt player in Love, who was clearly on the trade block and was putting up incredible numbers on a bad Timberwolves team. The idea of spreading out their current talent to make the team a bit more balanced was a solid one, and Love was a more established NBA player than Thompson at the time. And even though it probably would have been a mistake to make the deal, it still would have been really fun to see what Love could have done alongside Steph and Draymond under eventual head coach Steve Kerr. Between that and replacing Udoh for George or Hayward, there are some really cool possibilities here. Number 7, literally anybody and Nikola Jokic. Last up now, and this one takes a bit of a different angle in terms of interest compared to the other members of this list. Take a second and pick any star player or players in the NBA right now. Quite literally anybody you want to. Kawhi, LeBron, Giannis, Steph, KD, Russ, Kyrie, Dame, whoever you want. Any of them could have been teammates with a possible first-team All-NBA selection for this season, Nikola Jokic. There are no complicated free agency negotiations or trades or anything like that happening here, just an absolute gem of a draft pick in the second round. Back in 2014, much more highly regarded players like Andrew Wiggins, Joel Embiid, and Aaron Gordon were selected in the top 5 of that year's NBA draft, which is fine. But possibly the best player in the class, Embiid is the only one with an argument here, was selected with the 41st overall pick, giving every team in the league the opportunity to draft him that year and pair him with their current star. Now, just like with the Giannis situation earlier, nobody really saw this level of success coming for Jokic, which is why he was drafted where he was. But looking back on it, it is crazy to think about the fact that him and Embiid are the only 2 all-star caliber players from this class so far, and you can just put his incredible passing and offensive versatility on any team and in combination with any star. In the end, all of these star combinations are just what-if stories. Whatever circumstances that needed to happen for this to all come together never happened. So we'll never know what it would have been like to actually see these players on the same team. But I still found it incredibly interesting to look back on the beginning of the super team era and see which of these combinations almost happened. And that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then leaving a like rating is a great way to let me know. My name is Tucker, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.